Well, it's great to be here. 42nd anniversary. I think that's pretty remarkable. Give yourselves a hand. God knows we need you, that's for sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a great honor. I've heard of your organization many, many times over many, many years. And I've ran into Nancy Tate a few times over the years in various places. So it's a great privilege for me to be here. I'm very grateful to you. I want to start out with just a couple minutes telling you a little bit about myself. I think it's always interesting to know something about your speaker. Kind of confession time, if you will. I started out as a young Republican for Nixon in 1968. My dad was in the military, a career military guy. And in 1968, we were living up in the panhandle of Florida. You know, it's so conservative there, they call it Lower Alabama. And I was 16, and I was working on the Nixon campaign. And I did such a good job working on the Nixon campaign as a volunteer that they had a fish fry fundraiser for Nixon. And they asked me to sit at the head table with their invited speaker that evening. A guy that I'm sure many of you have heard of. He died a few years ago. A guy by the name of Senator Strom Thurmond from South Carolina. So that's how I got my start in politics. And then it kind of went downhill from there. In 1971, I tried to join the Air Force. I wanted to be like my dad. I wanted to be a career military man. But I flunked my physical because of an old high school football injury. So when most people of good sense were trying to stay out of the military because of the war in Vietnam, I had to get a waiver to get in. And so I was successful, and after my training, I was sent to a base in California that was an airlift base for the war in Vietnam, Travis Air Force Base, where GIs would come from all over America, get on the plane, go to Vietnam, and when the planes came back, they would bring the body bags of the dead soldiers, and scores and scores and scores of wounded GIs who would come to the hospital on our base. And on the weekend, almost every weekend, just a few plaintive souls standing outside the front gate holding their signs. And I can hear them talking to each other now. Do you think it does any good? Do you think we'll ever stop this war? Do you think anybody on the base is paying any attention to us at all? And little did those protesters outside the gate know that we would talk about them for days on end. In the chow hall, in the barracks, even on the job. And we had 15,000 permanently stationed GIs on our base, in addition to the thousands that came and went on the planes going back and forth to Vietnam. And this process, this agitation of creating sparks in the air, of creating discussion, literally liberated my consciousness and changed my life and turned me into a peace activist. And so after a time, I decided I was a conscientious objector, and I asked to be released from the military. And their first question to me was, well, what is your family history? Do you come from a traditional peace church? Well, no, actually, no, I come from a Republican military family. I was a young Republican for Nixon. And so they turned me down, and I did 3.5 years of what I call a hard time. Because after I figured out what was going on with the war in Vietnam, it was exceedingly difficult for me to be there. So finally I got out, and I was going to college at the University of Florida, just ready to graduate, when I got recruited to become a union organizer with the United Farm Workers Union, organizing fruit pickers in Florida. And so I quit college, never to return, never to graduate, to become a professional organizer. And for 15 years, as Mike said, I worked for the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice. And in that job, we began, investigating our bioregion, if you will. We began looking at what was going on with the space program. and the arms race moving into the heavens. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight, but first I want to put it all in a larger context. I want to, in the biggest way tonight, talk about where the U.S. military strategy is going today, what their plan is, their overall military plan, and then how, in the end, how we deal with it, how we get out from behind the 8 ball. I'm going to start out by reading to you a quote by a man by the name of Stephen Rosen, who wrote an article for the Harvard Review in 2002 called "The Future of War and the American Military." And this is what he said. "Our goal is maintaining our imperial position and maintaining imperial order. Now we're in the business of bringing down hostile governments and creating governments favorable to us. Finally, imperial strategy focuses on preventing the emergence of powerful hostile challengers to the empire, by war if necessary, but by imperial assimilation if possible." Now this Mr. Rosen was the director of the Olin Institute for Strategic Studies at Harvard. He at one time worked for the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, and was an instructor at the Naval War College. MIT professor Noam Chomsky says it another way. He says it's all about controlling most of the world's supply of oil as a lever of world domination. One way that we keep Europe and China and India and Russia and other emerging markets dependent on us, and in sync with our policies, Chomsky says, is to maintain control of the oil spigot that many of them are reliant on. In other words, the United States wants to hold the keys to the world's economic engine. To illustrate the point, China today imports 80% of its oil through the Taiwan Straits. And thus it's no coincidence that today the U.S. Navy is doubling its military presence in that particular region. The Aegis destroyer, made in the town where I live, in Bath, Maine, outfitted with so-called missile defense systems, is now being home-ported in Japan, South Korea, Australia, and even very possibly it's going to be put in Taiwan, just 90 miles off the coast of mainland China. Today, China has 20 nuclear missiles capable of hitting the west coast of the United States. And the idea of the Aegis destroyer is in a U.S. first strike attack, as China launches their retaliatory capability, and that's all it is, those 20 missiles, trying to get off some of them in a retaliatory strike, the Aegis destroyers parked up along the coast of China. Their job would be to intercept them as soon as they were launched. Japan is our unsinkable aircraft carrier today that is used to check rivals, both China and Russia. And now the United States is moving to militarily encircle Russia today by deploying these same so-called missile defense systems, this time in Poland and the Czech Republic. Ground-based interceptors under the ground in Poland, and a new Star Wars radar facility in the Czech Republic. Much to the agitation, I would say, of the people of the Czech Republic. 70% of the people in that country are opposed to the deployment of the Star Wars radar. 55% of the Polish are opposed to the deployment of U.S. so-called missile defense interceptors. It would only be useful in a U.S. first strike attack on Russia. Now, why in the world would the United States want to attack, encircle and attack Russia? Why? Could it be, in large part anyway, because Russia is the world's largest producer of natural gas?